this is going to be a learning experience for everybody. I've done one PowerPoint presentation in my entire life. That was a disaster. But I just thought it would be useful to have one of these things. Two quick comments. First of all, as you can see, I'm standing here alone. Anna Trout, my partner, both in my life and in the work that I've done over the past 30-some-odd years, was going to be here, but we have 6 non-human children that we have adopted, and the person who sits with them and stays with them when we travel developed pneumonia on Thursday, and we tried to get back up all we could. So Anna could not be here, but she sends her greetings to all of you. The other thing is that 3 weeks ago, I got into a car accident. Someone on a cell phone hit me and totaled my Volkswagen Beetle. The only thing in the world that I loved more than the Volkswagen Beetle and animate objects like Anna and the dogs and everybody else, but was my vitamins. Those are the only 2 material things that I own that I have affection for. But my Beetle was totaled, and I have a bad neck ache, which radiates pain to my entire head. They have given me things to help with that pain, but they are not things that I can take and be coherent when I speak with you. So I'm going to do my very, very best, despite the fact that I have a rather blinding headache this morning. And I can only say this to you, that it's been going on, and my students, because I teach, and my students have been telling me that my lectures in the past couple of weeks have been terrific. So I don't know if that means they're sadists or I'm a masochist. I'm not sure which. But in any event, so I'll do my very best. Okay. I talk about the abolitionist approach to animal rights. In the 1990s, I used to use the expression animal rights, just animal rights, because basically what I think now is not all that terribly, there's differences, but not that terribly different from what I used to think back then. The problem is I don't use animal rights anymore because animal rights has become a meaningless expression. Everybody uses animal rights now. In the 2010 book that I wrote, The Animal Rights Debate, which I co-wrote with a welfarist named Robert Garner, who teaches at Leicester in the United Kingdom, I started off my section of the book with a quote from a veal farmer who said that he thought animal rights were really important. And my point was that once institutional users are saying that animal rights are important, you know that the concept has lost its meaning and you need to be thinking and talking about something else. So now I talk about abolition. And you know, what happened in the 1990s was the animal organizations, you know, which were promoting welfarism, said, well, we're really abolition, we really believe in animal rights, but we think that we've got to get to animal rights through welfarist reform. I wrote a book about that in 1996 called Rain Without Thunder, in which I called that new welfarism, in which I said it was immoral and it would not work. I didn't realize in 1996 that things were going to get as bad as they've gotten now. I really did. I'm a fairly cynical guy, and I never would have predicted that we would have the mess that we have now in what we call the animal movement, which is, I think, an abject failure. And so now I use abolition, but the large groups are now starting to say, well, we're really abolitionists too. We just think that we need to use welfare reform and happy exploitation and single issue campaigns to get to abolition. And so they're doing the same thing. So I figure another 10 years I'm going to have to come up with something else. But for now, I'm calling it the abolitionist approach. There are 6 principles that I want to discuss with you. And then I hope if I can finish up, then I will take some questions. But the first principle, now, Zach, you're telling me? Oh, okay, it worked, I can't believe it. Okay, the abolitionist approach to animal rights, actually that was terrible, I should have fixed that. It should have said, rejects animal exploitation and maintains that all sentient beings have the basic right not to be treated as the property of others. Okay, the point is, all sentient beings have the right not to be treated as property. Okay, and what does that mean? Okay, well, let's think about it for a second. Most people, not just people in this room, but most people, if you go out and talk to them on the street, they believe that animals matter morally. They believe that they're not things, that there is some moral value, that animals have some moral value. They may not think that humans and animals are equal, which is an interesting concept we'll talk about today and this morning and later on today, this notion of equality, what it means. But but most people would say, if you ask them, do you think that animals are things that don't have any moral significance whatsoever? They would reject that, and they would say, no, of course not. Animals are not things, they have moral significance. Nevertheless, we treat them as if they were things, okay? We treat them as if they were things. Now, although most of us believe that animals have moral value, we treat them as a culture. We treat them as things. How do we explain that dissonance? And the answer to that is in certain ways easy. They're property. So no matter what we say about them as a matter of morality or anything else, whatever we say about them morally or socially or culturally, the fact is, as a matter of law and economics, they are property. They are chattel. They are things that have no intrinsic or inherent value. They only have extrinsic or external value. Okay? And so they're things. They're things. They have no value except that which we accord to them. Now, it is a fundamental principle of my view that if animals are going to matter morally, they can't be property. If animals are property, they will never matter morally. They can't matter morally. Now, we recognize this where humans are concerned. This is like not rocket science. This is like not that difficult to understand. We recognize this where humans are concerned. We reject human slavery. Okay? We reject human chattel slavery. As a matter of fact, human chattel slavery, which still exists, nobody defends it, it still exists. It is illegal in every nation in the world, and it is one of the few things that violates customary international law. There are very few things that violate customary international law, which are considered so morally odious that they must be rejected by any civilized society. Human slavery, human chattel slavery is one of them. As I say, it exists, no doubt about it. But nobody defends it, and wherever it's found, it is criticized. Okay? Now, why do we think human chattel slavery is worse than other things, bad things that we do? We recognize it as being qualitatively different. It is qualitatively different in terms of the fact that look, discrimination is bad, lots of stuff that we do is bad, but chattel slavery is in a class by itself. Because if you're a chattel slave, you're outside of the moral community. You have no moral value. You are a thing that is bought and sold. Okay? And we recognize that, there's a difference. Yes, discrimination is bad, but you're not talking about slaves. You're talking about humans who are regarded as moral and legal persons, and how we need to fix things so that those people are treated equally. Those persons, those moral and legal persons, are treated equally. But when it comes to animals, we don't do that. Okay? With slaves, we can't do that because it's their thing. There were lots of laws that protected slaves when we had race-based slavery in the United States. Lots of laws. They did nothing. They did absolutely nothing to protect the interests of the people who were enslaved. Why? Because whenever you have a conflict between a thing and the owner of a thing, the owner of the thing has got to win, or else you don't have the institution of property ownership. So whenever there was a conflict between the slave owner and the slave owner's got to win, or else the whole system of slavery dissolves. Okay? So there were lots of laws, tons of laws that supposedly protected slaves. They didn't work, and obviously chattel slavery was a complete disaster. Okay? So we recognize that if humans are going to matter, if they're going to be members of the moral community, if they're going to sit at the table, we might not treat them fairly. We might make them sit at the back of the table or back of the bus or whatever. So, and that's bad. Okay? But if they're going to matter at all, if they're going to be on the bus in the first place, they can't be chattel slaves. We recognize that where humans are concerned. We don't recognize that where non-humans are concerned. Now, why is that? Why is it? How do we distinguish? Why do we say that? Yeah, it's bad for any. We regard every human as having a right not to be a slave. Now, let's just take a digression for 1 second. What's a right? It's a simple concept. A right is a way of protecting an interest. That's all it is. Okay? So when you say you have a right to free speech, What does that mean? It means your interest in free speech will be protected even if the consequences of protecting it make other people, there are bad consequences. So let's say that somebody says, well, Francione's having free speech really irritates the hell out of HSUS, Mercy for Animals, PETA, and other organizations. So we should silence him because the consequences of his speaking, it makes a large number of people unhappy. The answer is, no, you can't do that because I have a right, which means my interest in expressing myself will be protected and won't be compromised or abrogated simply because there are bad consequences. Connected with some people don't like the consequences of my speech. It doesn't mean I have an absolute, just got that waving thing. It doesn't mean, does anyone have any heroin? I'm only kidding. And so it doesn't mean that I have an absolute right to say whatever. I can't yell, fire, fire in this room if there's no fire and you all run out. It's not protected. I can't engage in defamation. Okay, I can't engage in. There's other forms of speech that I can't engage in. So my right is not absolute, but we will not regulate my speech simply because some people don't like the consequences of my speech. That's all it means to say right. So we say humans have a right not to be property, not to be slaves. And what does that mean? What it means is that the interest that we all have in being persons and not things will not be compromised, will not be traded away, will not be ignored, just because the consequences of doing so will, it will make other people happier if we enslave people. It would make other people richer if we enslave people. It would help industry if we enslave people. No, those consequences we don't countenance them because we say the right not to be enslaved, the interest in not being chattel property is protected by this thing called a right. It's sort of like a fence that exists around the interest, and there's a sign saying you can't jump over, you can't violate the integrity of the fence, even if you get great benefits from doing so. Because there's an interest that's being protected because we believe it's fundamental to the concept of what a person is. And a person doesn't mean human. A person means somebody who counts morally. Okay? I have a book called Animals as Persons. That's one of the books that I wrote. And I use that intentionally, animals as persons. Okay? Because I realize that people say, what do you mean animals as persons? How can they be persons? They're not humans. And the answer is, it's not just humans that are persons. Persons mean, to be a person means one is a member of one has interests that count morally and legally. Okay? So the right not to be property is basically a right that all humans have, irrespective of how smart they are, how not smart they are, how beautiful they are, how not beautiful they are. It doesn't matter what their physical, what their personal characteristics are, their cognitive characteristics. What matters is that we don't enslave, and we don't regard enslaving any of them as appropriate. Okay, and we regard it as odious to suggest the contrary. Why don't we feel the same way about animals? Well, there's lots of reasons, but to boil it down to a very short answer, it's because we believe that animals are inferior. Okay, now we believe that they're inferior. There are basically two sorts of inferiority. There's spiritual inferiority. We are made in God's image. They are not made in God's image. Blah blah blah. And we have souls. They don't have souls. I'm not a theologian. I will say this though. To my friends who are religious, or to people who come up to me and say, "But what about the Bible?" I always tell them, you know what? It would be great if you read it before you ask me that question, because if you do, if you read Genesis, it says in the first chapter. I'm not religious. But the first chapter of Genesis says. God creates the world and says to the humans, the herb and the seed I give you, it shall be your food. It says to the animals, the herb and the seed I will give you, that will be your food. So everyone's a vegan in the beginning. It's only when there's a rupture of the covenant between God and humans are driven from Eden, that there then is, that killing begins. That's when the story of Cain and Abel is. Then you start having animal sacrifices, etc., etc. You read later on in the Old Testament, and when there is a reuniting, when the covenant is restored, then you see what Isaiah says. The lion and the lamb shall lay down, none shall be killed in all of my holy kingdom, and all that stuff. Okay? So if you're into religion, and you think that religion, justifies this in some way, you need to look deeper into it. I mean, again, I'm not a theologian, but it seems to me it's just common sense. Read the book, and and you see that it's a lot more complicated than that. I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of support for bad stuff in the Old Testament or the New Testament. There's lots of bad stuff in every religious book that but none of us like sort of. If you look at the Old Testament, there's some really vile stuff in there. And, we don't sort of sit there and say, well, the Old Testament says that, we can enslave people because there were slaves. There were slaves in the Old Testament, and that was just fine. And, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Who was the guy? I think it was Lot. And was it Lot? Anybody here know Lot? It was Lot. Yeah, he's one of the good guys of the Old Testament. And Lot, when the crowd came to Lot's house, because Lot had a couple of angels, I think he had some angels in his house or something, and they wanted to take him out, and he said, there were visitors to Lot's house, and he said, oh no, don't take them, take my daughters, rape them. And he's one of the good guys of the Old Testament. So, he's one of the heroes. You can't really sort of like look at the Old Testament, or any religious book, and say, well, there's all sorts of stuff in there. None of us. When I teach criminal law, my students say, well, it says in the Bible, an eye for an eye. It also says that, your parent, that you can be killed for being disrespectful to your parents, for engaging in adultery. We're doing all sorts of things that lots of people do. And that, that we focus on, killing you. We say if you kill somebody, it's all right to kill you. But if you look at the Old Testament, killing is permitted for a lot more than just murder. It's permitted for other infractions that none of us would say would, even if you believe in capital punishment, which I do not, but even if you did believe in that, you would never say that those things would justify capital punishment. Okay, so that's spiritual inferiority. Animals are inferior to us because we are spiritual. We're made in God's image. We have souls. They don't, etc., etc. But the main thing historically that we focused on is cognitive inferiority. The notion that animals are inferior to us mentally, cognitively, that we have sophisticated, we're sophisticated. We're able to reason. We're able to use symbolic communication. We're able to use concepts. We understand the notion of concepts, okay? They don't understand. They're not as sophisticated as we are. So it's all right for us to use them. Now, let's think about that for a second. What makes the ability to do calculus? I was thinking about that because I was talking to my friend Jeff, who is a high school math teacher, and I remember liking calculus very much. But the fact that, what makes doing calculus more superior, what makes a human being more superior because a human being can do calculus, and birds can fly with, just fly. I mean, fish can breathe underwater. I mean, what the hell's the moral value of being able to do calculus? I mean, it's interesting, it's fun. We see this where humans are concerned. Those characteristics are important because we say they are important. Okay? And so, and if fish ruled the world, they would say, well, being able to breathe underwater, that's morally significant, And so I mean, we're just, it's something we declare. What makes it morally relevant? And the answer is nothing other than our self-interested proclamation. That's the only thing that makes it, that makes that work. And we see this where humans are involved. I'm not saying cognitive characteristics are irrelevant. Let's say you've got a human being who is severely mentally disabled, and one who isn't. And the issue is UCLA wants to hire, a professor for something, or a teacher. You're not going to hire. If the question is who do you hire, the person who's mentally disabled or the person who's not mentally disabled, the answer is you don't hire the person who's mentally disabled to be a teacher because that's simply not going to work. But if the question is who do you use as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor, the person who's a normal intelligence or the person who's mentally disabled, the answer is you don't use either of them. Okay? So it's this notion that, I really maintain that, and what's interesting, let me show you, because I really want to get the PowerPoint thing that's on the screen with the typographical error off. And here we go. This is a quote from my buddy Peter Singer. Even Peter Singer, the father of the animal rights movement, buys into this notion of cognitive inferiority. He believes, he has a chapter in Animal Liberation in which he says all animals are equal. But really, what he means by that is their similar interests in not suffering should be accorded the same weight that our similar interests should be given, okay? But he doesn't, first of all, he doesn't believe that most of the time their interests in suffering rise to our level so that they're not similar in the first place. But most importantly, Singer perpetuates an idea that comes from Bentham that is hideous, corrosive, and is the foundation of the animal welfare movement, the idea that animals have an interest in not suffering, but they don't have an interest in continuing to live because they're not self-aware. They're not reflectively self-aware in the way that we are. We know we have names, we look at ourselves in the mirror, we see who we are, we are self-aware in a particular sort of way. And he said, well, animals aren't self-aware, so they don't really care if you kill them. They just care how you treat them and how you kill them. So if you treat them well and you kill them in a relatively painless way, you haven't really done anything immoral. Now, he has he equivocates. He says, well, the non-human great apes, they might be good. And it's this idea that the closer they are to us, the more they matter. And that's like saying black people matter more if they have light skin. Okay? It's that sort of really, I think, insidious sort of thinking. And so basically, Singer, this is a quote from Peter, in which he says, you could say it's wrong to kill a being whenever a being is sentient or conscious. Then you would have to say it's just as wrong to kill a chicken or a mouse as it is to kill you or me. I can't accept that idea. It may be just as wrong, but millions of chickens are killed every day. I can't think of that as a tragedy on the same scale as millions of humans being killed. What is different about humans? Humans are forward-looking beings and they have hopes and desires for the future. That seems a plausible answer to the question why it's so tragic when humans die. So it's tragic when humans die, but not when non-humans die because they don't have a sense of their life. Now, I agree that non-humans probably think different. I don't know how they think because the only way I can think, the only way you can think, is we have concepts. The concepts are linked to language. We're the only animal that uses symbolic communication. Okay, we're the only animal that uses symbolic communication. No, we are the only animal, but we'll talk about that. We are the only animal. Yes, you can teach apes to use. You can teach some apes, but it's not something that they don't start libraries in the wilderness and stuff like that. It's like stuff that they do in laboratories. They can get them to recognize things. But we are the only animals that use symbolic communication. I have no idea. Like we live with 6 dogs. I have no doubt that they think. I don't know how they think. I don't know what goes, but it's very clear that, and they are self-aware. They're self-aware in a different way from the way that I am self-aware. I don't think they recognize themselves in mirrors. I don't think they think of themselves in that way. But they clearly, they clearly can recognize. They are clearly self-aware. I watch them play with each other. You cannot engage in the activity of playing without being self-aware that it requires a fairly sophisticated, cognitive. There's something going on there. They're clearly self-aware. They're just self-aware in a different way from the way that I'm self-aware, the way you're self-aware. I believe every sentient being, every being that is perceptually conscious, that is subjectively aware, every being. I don't care whether it's a fish, whether I have no idea whether plants or mussels are sentient, but if they're sentient, I don't care, anything that is sentient. Any being who's sentient is self-aware in that when that animal is suffering, that animal knows that it is she or he who is suffering and not some third party. And that's all the self-awareness that's required. It's interesting. There's a phenomenon called transient global amnesia. And if you're talking to somebody, I've actually met and talked with people who have this. They're entirely normal. They present as entirely normal. But they have no sense of the past and no sense of the future. They're stuck in this eternal present. They go from consciousness, you ask somebody who's got TGA, if you say, what did you do yesterday? They don't remember. If you say, what are you going to do in 5 minutes? They don't know. Okay? They're stuck in this eternal present. Now, is that morally relevant? Well, yeah, I guess if you're going to hire a history teacher, it might not be good to hire somebody who's That's probably the case. However, if the question is it okay to kill somebody, take the organs out of somebody, use somebody in a painful biomedical experiment because they've got transient global amnesia, because they don't have an interest in living, because they're not forward-looking beings, I would say, look, if they felt that way, they would kill themselves. Okay? They obviously wish to go from one second of consciousness to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's how they are self-aware. Everybody's, there are humans who are not self-aware the same way normal humans are, but none of us would ever say they don't have an interest in continuing to live. So it is my position that any sentient being is self-aware for for purposes of saying all of them benefit, all of them should be beneficiaries of a right not to be treated as property. Okay. One thing, and all of them have a right not to be treated as property, and that means it's not a question of abolishing, regulating exploitation. We're morally obligated to abolish it. Okay, and one of the reasons somebody asked me this night, do I show gory movies? Do I show like Earthlings and these other movies to my students? The answer is no, never. And the reason I don't is I never want my students to read or watch something and take away from that the problem is the treatment, that we've got to make the treatment better, that the treatment is brutal, and we've got to make the treatment better. Okay, I always want to sort of focus on the idea is you. I don't care how pleasant. If you had a situation, I don't care whether, Whole Foods develops animal welfare rating 362, and, the animals are just like, they're complete bliss, and they die happily. I don't care. It would still be wrong. Just as it would be wrong. If I torture you to death, that's wrong. If I snuck into your room tonight and put a bullet into the back of your head while you were sleeping and did it the right way, you wouldn't feel anything. It would still be wrong. Okay? So I don't really care about treatment issues. I don't focus on treatment issues. I never show gory movies. I always say, I don't believe in happy exploitation. I think that's nonsense. I think that's a fantasy. But I don't really care about it. What I care about is getting people to understand that justice means we reject animal abuse, period. Okay, so that's the first principle. The second principle, the abolitionist position rejects animal welfare campaigns and single-issue campaigns. I think animal welfare campaigns are not only not useful, I think they're counterproductive. I think they push things backward because they encourage people to believe that there is a compassionate way, I hate that word, a compassionate way to exploit. And that's wrong. That is just wrong. Let's think about this for a second. About animals as property. They're chattel property. They're big, and I'm going to go into this more this afternoon. I'm going to do a whole thing. We're going to do a whole workshop on what's wrong with animal welfare. Because you know what? Most of you people are vegans. Most of you people probably don't think animal welfare is very good. You may support some of these campaigns with these neo-welfarist groups. We'll talk about that. But it's important for you to understand why it fails. Just so that you understand. You have arguments you can make to people. Because it's, in certain ways, there's a moral dimension and there's a practical dimension. The moral dimension is, if it's wrong to exploit animals, then we should not be promoting the humane exploitation of animals. If slavery is wrong, you don't promote humane slavery. It is that simple. Okay? We'll talk more about that this afternoon. But the practical aspects of it, animal welfare doesn't work because it can't work. Okay? It can't work. Animals are property. They have economic value. So if you've got a farmer, he buys the pig for $1, okay? And it costs the farmer, in terms of loss of the use of money, plus whatever the farmer puts into the animal, it costs the farmer 25 cents, okay? Now the farmer's got $1.25 invested in that animal. That means the farmer's got to sell the animal for at least $1.26 to make a profit, right? Now, there are two ways you can affect how that pig is going to be treated. You can persuade the farmer that in spending the 25 cents that the farmer is spending, the farmer could actually spend less money, and the farmer could take the animals out of the gestation crates and put them into group housing or use electronic sow feeding, and it would actually reduce the production cost of the farmer, and it would give the pigs more space. So it would actually make the exploitation of the animals more economically efficient. And that is what classical animal welfare does. Okay? Look at the campaign that that PETA and HSUS and all these groups have about gassing chickens. It's all based, read what they write. It's all based on the idea that if you gas chickens, you'll actually save money. And you know what? You were starting a chicken slaughterhouse tomorrow, and you didn't use controlled atmosphere killing, you'd be insane. Because it is a much more economically efficient way of producing animal products. Okay? So animal welfare becomes one of two things. Either it's making animal exploitation more economically efficient, okay? Or you're trying to work with the farmer to create niche markets for people who have a little bit more money. This is the Whole Foods phenomenon. Okay? So let's work with farmers and try to create a niche market where the animals are treated a little bit better, okay? And they pay more money. So they're sort of outside of the traditional market. That doesn't work either for lots of reasons, because if the demand is still there for the, quote, lower welfare product, lower welfare products are going to continue to be produced, okay? But in both cases, the traditional model of trying to make animal exploitation more efficient or trying to create niche markets, both of those have the insidious, corrosive effect of turning animal advocates into partners with industry, working with industry to make animal exploitation more acceptable, okay? And that is, I think, a disaster. I mean, if this is a social movement, if this is a movement that seeks justice and the abolition of animal exploitation, we should never be promoting, ever be promoting, working with industry. You don't work with industry. You oppose industry, okay? And what you do is never try to focus on the supply side and try to make the supply of animal foods better. Okay? You work on the demand side, and you try to educate people not to demand the stuff in the first place. That's the only way we're going to shift the paradigm. The only way. Okay. Is this all making sense? I'm not kidding. I got like on the Richter scale, I got like a 9 headache. Is this working okay? The abolitionist approach, all right, sees veganism as a moral imperative. Now, I believe that anything that's going to call itself an animal rights movement has to maintain that veganism is not an option. Okay? Veganism isn't an option, and it's not simply a way of reducing suffering. What we have right now in the United States, in Britain, in Australia, in Western Europe, I mean basically all over the place, is this idea that, well, veganism is the gold standard. That's really great, because it, but we shouldn't say that people have to be vegans, because there are other ways of reducing suffering, like cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and all of these other things. Okay, and so veganism is sort of an optional way. You see this vegan outreach, which is well, I'm going to show you some quotes. But all these organizations basically promote the idea that veganism is simply one way of reducing suffering. It's not a moral imperative. It's not something that we are obligated to do. All right, well, let's look at some quotes, just so you don't take my word for it. This is vegan outreach, which vegan outreach is the veganism, what National Socialism was the National Socialism. But veganism is not an end in itself. It is not a dogma or religion, nor a list of forbidden ingredients or immutable laws. It is only a tool for opposing cruelty and reducing suffering. Okay? So, I mean, look, I'm not saying it's certainly not a religion, but it's like if you oppose slavery, anti-slavery is is got to be a fundamental. It's not just sort of an option. It's just like, well, it's a way of reducing suffering. It's not a way of reducing suffering. It is a moral imperative. If animals matter morally, then the one thing we know we can't do is kill them or make them suffer for no reason whatsoever. You don't even need a theory of animal rights to get there. The bottom line is if your conventional wisdom, what you think is that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals, then if that moral principle means anything, then it must mean that you cannot justify imposing suffering or death on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. And that is those are the only justifications we have for inflicting suffering and death on 58 billion land animals a year and probably 1 trillion sea animals. They taste good. Those are the only justifications we have for all animal exploitation. The only sort of exploitation that requires a more nuanced analysis is the use of animals to cure serious human illnesses. I'm opposed to that too, absolutely. Would not kill one rat to find a cure for cancer. Not that that's possible, I wouldn't do it. So I'm totally opposed to that, but I think that requires a little bit more of a discussion. But the bottom line is if you think that animals matter morally, and you accept the principle that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering, then that principle has no meaning whatsoever. None. Absolutely none. Absolutely none. If you say it's okay to kill for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. Okay? So it's clear to me, and I hope it's clear to you, that veganism is a moral imperative. It's not an option. It's like if animals matter morally, the one thing that we know is we can't eat them, wear them, or use them. Okay? We might, we might have to have the idea of eating them at all, which is the main use that we make of them. My view is I focus a lot on eating. People say, well, isn't that a single issue campaign? No, it's not a single issue campaign. It's basically nothing changes until people stop eating them. Once they, for ethical reasons, once they stop eating them for ethical reasons, they don't buy wool anymore. They don't go to circuses. They don't, once you get them on the eating thing, everything else follows. Until you get them on the eating thing, virtually nothing else. All right. Here we have Peter, my friend Peter Singer, again. To avoid inflicting suffering on animals, not to mention, Phil, can you come up and read this because I'd like the Australian accent morning. To avoid inflicting suffering on animals, and not to mention the environmental costs of intensive animal production, we need to cut down drastically on animal products we consume. But does this mean a vegan world? This is the father of the animal rights movement. That's one solution, but not necessarily the only one. If it is the infliction of suffering that we are concerned about rather than killing, then I can also imagine a world in which people mostly eat plant foods, but occasionally treat themselves to the luxury of free-range eggs, or possibly even meat from animals who live good lives under conditions natural for their species and then are humanely killed on the farm. This is the father of the animal rights movement. I'd rather be an orphan. Okay? Here's Peter and Mother Jones. There's a little bit of room for indulgence in all of our lives. I know some people who are vegan in their homes, but if they're going out to a fancy restaurant, they allow themselves the luxury of not being vegan that evening. I don't see anything really wrong with that. I don't eat meat. I've been a vegetarian since 1971. I've gradually become increasingly vegan. I'm largely vegan, but I'm a flexible vegan. That means you ain't a vegan. I don't go to the supermarket and buy non-vegan stuff for myself, but when I'm traveling or go to other people's places, I will be quite happy to eat vegetarian rather than vegan. Well, let me tell you, that is just complete nonsense. I mean, the idea that there's a moral distinction between meat and other animal foods is ridiculous. I mean, animals used for dairy are kept alive longer, they're treated every bit as badly, and they all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. I mean, this idea, meat-free, meatless Monday, or whatever that nonsense is. I mean, the idea that we're encouraging the idea that dairy and eggs are somehow a morally better food, or morally better foods, is ridiculous. There is no coherent distinction. Vegetarianism is an incoherent moral position. It should be rejected. If animals matter, there is one position. Here's other Singer quotes. I mean, basically he's saying in this one that, if you're at a restaurant and they bring something that's, they bring your food out, they bring your vegan food out, and your vegan food has got, cheese on it or something. Don't make a big fuss. Eat it, because people will think that you're being fanatical. And the answer is, wow. That's like saying, if someone's like sitting there telling a racist joke or an anti-Semitic joke, you should like sort of eat it up because you shouldn't say anything, because if you do, you're going to offend anti-Semites or racists. And the answer is, well, if that's the way you think, then you are a moral unit. And you've got serious issues with understanding what morality is. If somebody makes a racist comment or an anti-Semitic comment, or we're under an obligation to say something about that. Does anybody disagree with that? I mean, if somebody makes a racist joke, don't you think it's like your obligation? I mean, the idea that, well, I don't want people to think that I'm a fanatic, so I'll eat the cheese. You know what you do if you eat the cheese? You just told those people you don't regard this as serious issues. That's what you told them. Okay. I'm not going to read that. That's basically this. There's a part of the corporate animal welfare movement. This is a quote from Nathan Runkel of Mercy for Animals, which is basically HSUS Light. And they're all basically the same thing. These groups are all basically the same. And this is a quote from Runkel where he's basically saying, well, for me, the choice would be, to eat the carrot probably because, but it's not the choice everyone makes. Well, duh, it's not the choice that everyone makes. The idea of what we're supposed to do as a social justice movement is educate them about why that's the choice they should make. So when people say to me, well, people aren't going to go vegan overnight. I know they're not going to go vegan overnight. But it's our obligation to make it clear that if they take animal interests seriously, they have an obligation to go vegan. If they choose to not go vegan, that's their choice. But it should never be something we encourage them to do. We should never be with this, well, you know, I don't want to be judgmental. You can't have a social movement, people. You can't have a social movement. You can have, you know, you can have coffee clutches, and you can have some social events and things like that. You cannot have a social movement which is not judgmental. There is no such thing as a non-judgmental social movement. Okay? So we need, I'm not saying you have to be nasty to people. I'm absolutely not. If somebody says, you know, I had a student come up to me, a while back, and she came up to me, she said, I've given up beef. And I said, oh. And she said, well, don't you have anything positive to say? And I said, actually, you're probably killing more animals now, because more animals can, you know, more people can eat one cow. Are you eating chicken? Yeah, I eat chicken. I said, so like, what's the deal? I said, you know, why'd you stop eating meat? Well, I think it's wrong. Why? Well, because they're higher in the chain. I said, what do you mean they're higher? What chain are we talking about? And so, you know, I mean, now, you know, should I have said that? Now, and there are some people, lots of people who probably think I should have said, oh, that's so wonderful. I'm glad you've given up beef. That's so wonderful. You're a good person. Turn around so I can pet you. And the thing is that that's nonsense. I'm not going to do that. Neither should you. Okay? I mean, I'm not saying you have to be abusive. You should never be abusive. It's a movement of nonviolence. You shouldn't be abusive, but you should make it clear. If somebody comes up to you and says, I'm a slave owner, you don't get violent with that person, you don't attack that person, but you say, I think slavery is wrong. And the same thing with animals. If they matter morally, then we have an obligation to make it clear. This nonsense, we can't be judgmental, we can't do this, we can't. If we are judgmental, if we can't comfortably make the judgment that animal exploitation is wrong, we're the wrong business people. It's time to sort of like do something else. Okay? Because okay. One thing about I wanted to go back to just one thing about welfare rights here, about welfare campaigns. I also oppose single issue campaigns. We're going to talk about that this afternoon. Single issue campaigns are things like the anti-fur campaign, or let's get elephants out of the circus, or let's stop live exploitation. I think this idea that what we're doing is we're encouraging people to believe that certain forms of exploitation are better than other forms of exploitation. I mean, the fur campaign. I mean, look. It's ridiculous. I mean, there's no difference, moral difference between fur, leather, wool, silk. There is no difference whatsoever. So this idea that that somehow we can focus on fur, or we can focus on we focus on fur. So what? I mean, it's a single issue campaign. It suggests that leather and wool are somehow morally more desirable. They aren't. Okay. Also, those campaigns, single issue campaigns, like the elephant one is a good example. The Ringling Brothers campaign. Where everyone's excited about the elephants. Well, they're now bringing camels into Ringling Brothers, and they're still using lions and tigers and horses and dogs. And so it's like, well, we like elephants though because they're more like us. They grieve when each other dies. And they all because they're like us. They're similar to us, so they count more morally. That's speciesism. That is exactly what speciesism is. I mean, these campaigns, like getting all excited about the dolphins and Tai Chi. Yes, I think it's terrible what they do, but I also think there ain't no difference between how many non-vegans are involved in criticizing the Japanese for what goes on in Tai Chi. What's the difference between a dolphin and a chicken? Right. There ain't none. Okay, there ain't none. And so, and single issue campaigns, as I will explain today, also lend themselves to thanks a lot. Thanks. Single issue campaigns lend themselves to discrimination against humans. The anti-fur campaign, as I will talk about this afternoon, was violently sexist. Okay, most of these campaigns, the live export campaign that goes on in Britain and Australia, very, very, very much ethnocentric. It's this idea that let us slaughter them. We'll do it much better than those foreigners will. The Tai Chi. I mean, there's a whole. These things are really terribly problematic when it comes to human rights issues. I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon. I have examples that I'm going to show you. Examples. Okay. Sentience is the only requirement for membership in the moral community. For Singer, in order to be a member of the moral community, you've got to be self-aware in a human-like way. I think that's a disaster. I think that's wrong. Even from Tom Reagan, who was a friend and somebody that I like very much, I disagree with Tom in that he says, as Gary Steiner pointed out yesterday, that the members of the moral community who matter are what he calls subjects of a life. They are beings who have, for want of a better word, preference, autonomy. He believes they have to have a certain level of cognitive sophistication. Again, I reject that. My view is if you're sentient, that's the only characteristic you need to be a full member of the moral community, that they have the right not to be treated as property. And I think anything else is just speciesism. What we're doing is we're privileging cognitive characteristics, which we see as making animals more similar to us. And the answer is, that's interesting ethologically, but it's not interesting morally. My dogs are different from elephants, I'm sure, in lots of ways cognitively. But the idea that they matter less than my dogs do, my dogs matter less than the elephant does, is something I reject. I actually wrote an essay once called "An Elephant may weigh more than a chicken, but not morally." And I really believe that. I don't think that chickens and elephants are morally distinguishable for purposes of not. We cannot justify treating either of them, the chicken or the elephant, as a thing. Okay. All right. And again, the single issue campaigns, almost all of them, or many of them, I should say, many of them, privilege certain animals. Elephants are regarded as more important, dolphins are regarded as more important, whales are regarded as more important. That's nonsense, complete nonsense in my view. And I think it's corrosive, it gets us from thinking clearly about the basic issues. The abolitionist, Bob, how long have I got? 11:45?
Get to 11:45, another 10, 11 minutes.
Yeah, okay. All right. The fifth characteristic I'm trying here, folks. The abolitionist approach rejects all forms of discrimination. As I said last night, the bottom line is that if speciesism is wrong, it's wrong, which I believe it is, it's wrong because, like other forms of discrimination, it uses an irrelevant criterion to exclude beings from the moral community. I got news for y'all. If you believe that, how many people believe that? That it's wrong, that speciesism is wrong because it's like other forms of discrimination. It excludes animals from the moral community. It excludes animals from the moral community based on an irrelevant criterion species. Correct. Most of you people agree with that, right? All right. Then you are committed, we are committed as a movement to opposing all forms of discrimination. You cannot say that speciesism is bad because it's like racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, but we don't have a position on racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism. We don't have a position on that stuff. We're animals. And the answer is, sorry, that don't work. If we believe that speciesism is wrong, it's rooted in the idea that all forms of discrimination are wrong. That doesn't mean y'all have to join every other social movement. And I tell my friends in other social movements, I say, look, I have a friend who she does terrific work for children, for abused children. And she said, well, I can't get into your movement because I'm doing my work. I said, keep doing the work for the children. Keep doing the work. But you got to eat 3 times a day. Don't eat animal products. You got to buy shoes. Don't buy leather. You got to buy clothes. Don't buy wool. I'm not asking you to get into my movement in an active way other than your choice to stop participating in the direct exploitation of sentient beings who are not able to be distinguished coherently, logically from the children you care about. Okay? And so it doesn't mean they have to all jump into our social movement or that we need to jump into theirs. But one thing we've got to stop doing is we've got to stop engaging in racism, sexism, and heterosexism in our campaign. The animal rights movement, or whatever the hell you want to call this thing, the animal movement is vitally sexist. One of the reasons why Anna and I split from PETA years ago, when I first got involved, when Anna and I first got involved with this in the early 1980s, a long time ago, we were involved with PETA when it was first started. Okay, one of the reasons, there were several reasons, but one of the reasons why we stopped doing we both did it pro bono. Anna was the lawyer that she is now, but I used to do their legal work, she used to do a lot of their other work, and we all did it pro bono. We never got paid for it. One of the reasons why we withdrew from PETA, several reasons, was because of the "I'd rather go naked than wear fur" campaign, which has become so violently misogynistic that we need to once every campaign that they have is focusing on denigrating women. And that's got to stop, because if speciesism is bad, it's bad because it's like sexism, and sexism and misogyny are bad, and we've got to stop it. Every time, you know, go on Facebook, not now, but go on Facebook, go on Facebook and look at the rhetoric. Every time they post, somebody posts something about, you know, people eating dogs in Korea, all the anti-Asian rhetoric. And the answer is, do I think people should eat dogs or cats? The answer is no, of course not. But I don't think that that's any different from eating cows or pigs or chickens. So, you know, you have non-vegans. They're all, you know, you want to talk about insanity. You get HSUS. It's like, got this campaign out because they're bringing all these animals from Korea. They're rescuing these animals. Well, isn't this just that dandy? So they're bringing them here, okay? They're bringing dogs from Korea here. So those dogs will get adopted because there will be no publicity, you know, there'll be publicity. People will adopt those dogs. Other dogs here who are here will die, okay? And we're somehow suggesting that the Koreans are morally worse than we are because they eat dogs. That's what we call ethnocentrism, xenophobia, or racism. That's what we call that, okay? Similarly, whenever you see something about Tai Chi, it's always those barbaric Japanese. And the answer is, should the Japanese be doing that? No. Are we any less barbaric? No. Okay? So this idea that the Japanese somehow have a monopoly on barbarism is just bullshit. And I don't mean any to denigrate the feces of bulls. But I mean, it's just wrong. Okay? And so we've got to get that stuff out of our campaign. Okay. The final thing is I guarantee you, these are some of the things that I found. Like, look, 10 seconds. I mean, this is the garbage. You know, I mean, this embarrasses me. This embarrasses me for people to think that this is my movement, that this sort of crap is my movement. No, it's not my movement. I'm not interested in this sort of thing. Neither should you be. And anybody who supports PETA, that's the stuff you're supporting. I wouldn't do it. The abolitionist approach promotes nonviolence. The problem is violence. You know, there was this, you know, a lot of people think religion is the problem. No, religion isn't the problem. Yes, religion has been used, you know, people who have been religious have used religion to justify violence to animals. But you know what? You know, when somebody like the late Christopher Hitchens, who was one of the new atheists along with Dawkins and Harris, when he says, well, the problem is religion, that's nonsense. Pol Pot was an atheist. Mao was an atheist. Stalin was an atheist. And they were responsible for lots of animal exploitation. So this idea that religion is the problem is ridiculous. The problem is violence, not religion. And it gets me concerned when I hear, one of the reasons why I developed this in the late 80s, early 90s, when I started developing it, was I was getting concerned because I was meeting a lot of animal people who thought violence was the issue, that, you know, we needed violence against this group, against that group, and that's ridiculous. If violence was the answer to anything, we'd be living in Eden right now. Because in case you haven't noticed, the history of humankind has been one long story of violence. And it doesn't get any better. Violence begets violence. We need to be the new peace movement of the 21st century, okay? And part of that is reaching out and taking into consideration and taking seriously the interests of other marginalized groups, okay? But we need to also reject violence. You know, I had a lot of people say, well, you know, you're opposed to the ALF. It's not a question of being opposed to the ALF. It's a question of being opposed to the incoherence of violence. You know, I had an interesting discussion. I was giving a lecture at Guelph University up in, I don't remember exactly when it was, but there was snow on the ground, so it must have been like July, in Toronto, and or in Ontario, not Toronto, somewhere in Ontario. And I was giving this lecture at Guelph, at the veterinary school. It was a very popular lecture. And this woman came up to me and she said that she identified herself as a member of the Animal Liberation Front support group. And she said, you know, I just think your views about violence are terrible. And I said, what? And she said, well, let me give you a question. Let me ask you a question, straight question. She said, if a vivisector is using 60 dogs a year in a biomedical experiment, then isn't it morally justifiable to inflict harm on the vivisector, to kill the vivisector or engage in violence against the vivisector? Because aren't you obligated to do that for those 60 animals? And the answer to that is, let me ask you a question. You a vegan? Yeah, I'm a vegan. is your mother vegan? She said, what difference? I said, just answer the question, is your mother vegan? And she said, no. And I said, what sort of meat does your mother eat? She said, well, she eats a lot of chicken. I said, your mother eats chicken twice a week? Oh yeah, more than that. I said, your mother is responsible for at least 60 chicken deaths a year, probably a lot more, actually much more than 60 chickens. I said, all right to kill your mother? And she said, well, what's that got to do with it? I said, what's that got to do with it? I said, if it's all right to kill the vivisector because the vivisector is using dogs, why is it okay? Is this just because dogs matter more than chickens? I mean, is that what we're organic or something else? And she said, well, it's not the same thing. I said, sure, it's the same thing. I said, your mother is participating in the demand for animal products. Your mother is participating. I said, what your mother's doing, there are differences, but they are not relevant differences. The analogy holds. What your mother's doing is no different from what the vivisector is doing. So this nonsense, it might appeal to 16-year-olds who have just read Che Guevara and want to do chest pounding and heavy breathing or something like that. But the reality is, this idea, I'm not trying to sort of say anything bad about Che Guevara, he was an interesting character, but I really think it's very, very important that we reject violence. This ought to be a peace movement. And it just makes me horrified when I see people on 60 Minutes saying, well, there was some persons that from the Animal Liberation Front who was saying that, well, killing a vivisector, that might be what's required to stop all this. The answer is no, it's not going to stop all this because there was a lot of violence in the 1970s in Britain and the use of animals in vivisection has gone up. So, first of all, it doesn't work. Secondly, it's the world. We need to be the new peace movement. So, that in a nutshell, okay, is the best I can do with the worst headache I've had in the past 50 years. We are a movement, we are a progressive movement. It's time that we saw ourselves as a progressive movement, okay? And that we are a movement that believes in human rights, animal rights, and that sees all of this as a matter of justice. I'm so happy to be here with you. It's wonderful to be with my colleague and comrade Bob, to see people I haven't seen in a long time, people I work with like Jeff Purz and Sandra Cummings, and of course Sherry and Michael and Sue Coe, who is probably responsible for more vegans in the world. She is a world famous artist. Her stuff hangs in the Metropolitan, and there are probably more people who have seen this stuff than there's one vegan. We have about 60 of her things hanging, of her pieces hanging in the house. And nobody ever comes into that house without having a discussion. They say, oh wow, look at this. And we all have a discussion about it. And a lot of those people have really started thinking about veganism in large part because of her work. It is wonderful. And with Carlo here and Ariana, people came and Soledad came from Argentina, and this is a World Vegan Summit. So let's get moving with the with the chores ahead of us this afternoon, because Anna's not here and some of our other activists were not able to make it for various reasons. I'm going to do something on rights versus welfare. Jeff and Sandra will join me. I want you to be there. Educate yourselves about why it all doesn't work and why animal rights and abolition is the only way we should be going if we take animal interests seriously. Peace to you all.